Well, thank you all for coming back one more time. Um, I was thinking this week about some famous firsts and lasts that we experience in life. Maybe it was that first car, or the first kiss, your first child, or in our case, we have experienced the first grandchild. Actually, now the second grandchild. That's a great thing too. Uh, but then there are also those last things that you experience in life. We had four children, and I figured out once that we had kids in diapers for 11 years. Approximately 22,000 changes of diapers. When we got down to the last one, I took the last diaper in the house, I bought my wife a potted thing of flowers, and I wrapped the diaper around the pot and gave it to her to celebrate that we were finally done with diapers. One of the last times that I was in a small airplane was memorable. We got up to altitude, somebody opened the door, and the guy behind me pushed me out. You don't forget that experience. Or the last time that I ever played at my mom's house. Talk about closing a chapter in life. About 6 years ago, my mom passed away at the age of 80. Caught us by surprise. Mom seemed to be doing well, but she had a massive stroke and she was gone very suddenly. And in the aftermath of Mom's passing, there was a lot of sorting and cleaning, and any of you who have been through that process of an estate sale and all that goes with it, you know it's a big job. And one night, in fact, I've given a series of talks much like this once before, and it was while I was giving that set of talks that this was going on. And I was over at her house late one evening, and just going through closets and boxing things up. And as I was going through this closet, I found the box of toys that she had for the grandkids. And as I was sorting out the box of toys, I found this little wood puzzle. It was a little giraffe that when you put it together, all the different colored blocks, I think it was the letters of the alphabet, and they made a giraffe. And for whatever reason, I think because it was late, I was tired, it was just kind of nostalgic, I found myself sitting on the floor putting together a children's puzzle in my mom's house. And the thought crossed my mind that this would be the last time that I would ever play at my mom's house. Kind of a weird thought, but just kind of let that settle in. And as I put the little giraffe together, I was sort of disappointed to realize that it wasn't complete. I could find every piece to the puzzle except one. And I searched all over in that closet. I don't know why, but suddenly that became really important to me to try and finish putting together the little puzzle. And I couldn't find that last piece. You know, we've been talking the last several weeks about the puzzle of faith. And I've used that metaphor to describe what it's like sometimes in life when we look at all the options, all the competing theories, our own doubts, our own questions, and I've compared it to a jigsaw puzzle. That sometimes when you see the pile of all the pieces, you think, can any of this make any sense? And I've suggested to you that one of the places to begin with the jigsaw puzzle is to find the corners. If you can find the corner pieces, you at least know that there really is a picture there to be worked on. It's not just chaos. And the more you work at that puzzle and you begin to find the edges, the more the picture begins to make sense. And I've been, I think, honest with you in saying that as I've reassembled the puzzle of faith in my life, there is still a pile of pieces that I don't know exactly where they all go. I don't think that anyone who is really honest about the journey of faith can say that they've got everything figured out. But I've come far enough in putting the puzzle together that I feel pretty confident that I'm working on the right picture, and that it's worth the pursuit to keep assembling it. We've talked about some of the key corner pieces the last few weeks. I started off talking about the evidence from the world around us. We talked about things that we see in the galaxy, things that we see all the way down to DNA, things that seem to point to the fact that we are not alone, that there is an intelligent creator working behind and above and through it all. The second week we talked about a philosophical problem, the problem of evil and pain and suffering. And I suggested that there is another problem right alongside of that we don't oftentimes give enough credence to, and that is the problem of good and right and purity. And why do we believe that those things exist? Last week we talked about a third piece, which becomes more specific to the Christian faith, and that is Jesus Christ himself. Did he really exist? Can we really trust the documents that purport to tell us his story? And if he did really exist, the most sensational thing that he did, and on which Christianity completely rests its claims, is the resurrection. If Jesus, in fact, actually did come back from the dead, that changes everything when I start looking at worldviews. And we talked last time about some of the evidence historically that says that, as incredible as it is to believe, that really did happen. This week I want to look at a fourth piece, what I call the missing piece, which is that personal connection with God. You know, sometimes as we work through this puzzle of life, we find that there are pieces that we struggle to find. Sometimes maybe we're even tempted to just throw the puzzle away because we can't make sense out of it. And we are tempted to give up. John Polkinghorne is a British particle physicist who became a minister after he finished his career in physics. Here is what he said. It seems to me that many educated people in the Western worldview, in the Western world, view religious belief with a certain wistful wariness. They would like some sort of faith, but feel that it is only to be had on terms which amount to intellectual suicide. They can neither accept this idea of God nor quite leave it alone. And yet, we wrestle with these pieces. I believe they begin to point us toward the reality of God. I believe they point us toward Jesus Christ. And yet I want to try and move the discussion this evening down about 10 inches. Much of my own quest of faith has been an intellectual one. And yet, for faith to really begin to have an impact, it needs to move from my head down to my heart. The scientific method and philosophy will get you only so far. Try falling in love using just the scientific method. Try finding the girl that will let you propose to her based on just the scientific method. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, said this. He said, "The heart has reasons that reason knows nothing of. We know this in countless ways." While I said that much of my journey has been one of the mind, I also have found that for every argument, there is a counter-argument. Francis Collins, I mentioned, the head of the Human Genome Project, an outspoken Christian, versus Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, an outspoken atheist. John Polkinghorne, a noted physicist, versus Richard Dawkins, a noted biologist. In fact, there was a book title I ran across years ago that I liked what it said. I liked the title almost better than the book. By Daniel Taylor. It was called The Myth of Certainty. If all you're going to do is try and line up one argument against another, you'll always find someone that can be the worthy opposition. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 says this. "Be warned, my son, of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body." As much as I would like to be a reductionistic materialist, I have come to realize that the world is not quite that simple. C.S. Lewis once said in his book, The Abolition of Man, "The kind of explanation which explains things away may give us something, though at a heavy cost. You can't go explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away." The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. To see through all things is the same as not to see. If God is real, then somewhere it has to move to a different level. Christianity is not just a philosophical construct. C.S. Lewis, we gave the book away this evening. When he wrote his spiritual autobiography, he titled it Surprised by Joy. Lewis, as you know, was quite a thinker. You can read books like Mere Christianity or God in the Dock, and you see a man of great intellectual inquisitiveness and power. He was an Oxford Don, a professor of English language and literature for 29 years. Much of his life, he was a committed atheist. And yet he was one who found himself increasingly bothered by the sense that perhaps God really was there. In fact, Lewis says that it not only began to invade his thoughts, but he began to compare it to a chess game where he felt like his opponent relentlessly kept moving the pieces into place, cornering Lewis to where he couldn't avoid the checkmate. Finally, Lewis came to a point of decision himself. Here's how he describes his own conversion. "I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." Someone asked him what his experience was like of finding God. He replied, "It was rather like the mouse saying, 'I found the cat.'" Every story is unique. All kinds of people meet God in all kinds of ways. Henry Ford convinced us that if a thing was worth doing well, it was worth being mass-produced. And yet, real craftsmen know that that is not how a work of art is created. If you go to an auto body shop, auto body guys are craftsmen. They can take a dented up door like this and work their magic on it and hammer it back into something that looks beautiful and new. It's probably a good metaphor for life, isn't it? All of us pull into the shop a little worse for the wear. We've all been hit by stuff. We've all driven into stuff ourselves, and we are dented and broken up in lots of different ways. Some of us don't look that bad just at first glance. My truck got rear-ended a few weeks ago, and I didn't think it was that bad. It kind of put some paint scuffs on the rear bumper, and it actually looked okay. Until I began to look at it more. I mean, really look at it. And then I took it to the auto body shop, and they looked at it. And they started describing things that were bent where you couldn't see they were bent. And the bill kept getting bigger and bigger for what it was going to take to fix the bumper on this truck. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm kind of like that. I don't look too bad just at first glance. But if you really know me, and I know stuff about me that you don't know, you go, it's more beat up than it looks. Don't laugh, you are too. How God works in your life. God is a craftsman. It will be unique to each one of us. I was reading in the Bible some of the stories in the New Testament about people that Jesus encountered and how he dealt very differently with different people. There's one guy by the name of Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a sophisticated religious figure. He was part of the elite, a member of what was called the Sanhedrin. And by and large, his colleagues didn't buy into Jesus. They rejected Jesus' claims. And yet, Nicodemus obviously had a spiritual hunger that drew him to want to have a conversation with Jesus. A clandestine one, if you will. The Bible tells us that Nicodemus showed up at night, when nobody was going to see, to have this quiet little conversation. And as he starts talking to Jesus, he begins to ask him some complex theological questions of their time. Jesus seems to see right through Nicodemus and know that the question isn't really the question. And he says, Nicodemus, you need a new birth. You need to be born again. That wasn't even the question Nicodemus was asking. And yet Jesus knew what was really going on inside. Nicodemus wanted to know how to really be right with God. And Nicodemus is puzzled. What does Jesus mean by this talk about being born again, being made new? What does it look like? How do you quantify it? How do you put it into a formula? And Jesus says, Nicodemus, in fact, it comes from John chapter 3, verse 8. He says, the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell from where it comes or where it's going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Nicodemus, God can do things that seem mysterious, hard to wrap your hands around, and yet it's like the wind. You can tell it's doing stuff. If you've ever flown a kite, you recognize the power of the wind. I love flying my stunt kite. And when you've got the controls on this kite, you can feel the wind. You can feel as you fly out of the envelope of the wind and it begins to slack off and you come back into the center and the power picks up. This kite will practically drag you down the beach with a good wind. And yet you can't see anything except you can see and feel the power as you watch the kite. Jesus says to Nicodemus, that's kind of how God's Spirit is. Sometimes he does things that you can't really quantify it, and yet you can see that something powerful is happening. Or another guy, a guy named Zacchaeus, totally different character. He's a tax collector. By his fellow countrymen, he was seen as the dirge, the scum of the earth, if you will. He worked for the Romans, taking their money and padding his own pocket with their permission. He was a wealthy man. And yet Zacchaeus was interested in who Jesus was. And the story is that he showed up with a great crowd, and he was a little short guy. And so he climbs up in a tree so he can get a view, because no one's going to give Zacchaeus the time of day to get to the front of the crowd. I come from a family of short people. I would have them stand, but there's no point. You wouldn't see them. But Zacchaeus, they will get me later for that. Zacchaeus is a little guy. There he is in the tree, just trying to be a spectator. And yet Jesus approaches Zacchaeus in a completely different way from Nicodemus. He actually calls him out, points to the tree and says, hey, Zacchaeus, come on down from the tree. I'm going to come to your house and I'm going to have dinner with you today. Self-invited himself. The result of that dinner transformed Zacchaeus' life. Or maybe you know the Apostle Paul, the most prolific writer in the New Testament, and yet he did not start off as any friend of Jesus. He was, in fact, a committed antagonist. And yet, as he was on his way to go and find Christians to put in jail, he's going to a city called Damascus, and on the Damascus road, he has this encounter. He gets literally knocked to the ground, blinded, sees a vision, and hears a voice speaking to him. Here's how he relates it. He says, we all fell to the ground. I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Wow. That was a story that Paul told over and over again in his life. Whenever he had a chance to talk about what had changed him from being a persecutor of followers of Christ to being an outspoken follower himself, he would tell this story. fact, he ended up speaking in front of Porcius Festus. He was the Roman procurator of Judea. And after he had shared his story, Festus interrupts him, and here's what he says. You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. So, in the tradition of Paul, I'm going to take a risk this evening and tell you a story that I've only told once before in public. By the time I'm done, you may feel about me the way Festus felt about Paul. But if I don't tell it, the story of my return to faith will not be complete. The lady came in the store and she said, "Don't stop too soon." It was an odd comment. We were talking about kids. I just met this lady. She came in, introduced herself. We're talking about our families. She asked how many kids we had. We had 3 kids. And she says to me, "Don't stop too soon." And gives me a little monologue about the virtues of a 4th child. She had no idea the emotions and the thoughts that she triggered in me with that odd little comment. I look back over the prior 5 months and where my life had come from and what it had become. I told you I went through seminary. I had a great time in seminary. I was actually student body vice president. I'd been a published freelance writer for David C. Cook, written some of their lesson curriculum. I'd been a pastor. Loved being a pastor. I'd even been president of the County Ministerial Association. And yet the lady talking to me is not talking to me as a pastor. I'm standing in an office supply store selling pencils at minimum wage. I'd been a counselor. Now, I was a spiritual and emotional wreck. I had spent years in my education, in my experience, and now all of it seemed to be completely wasted. I was a homeowner. We'd bought our first home, a cute little place in the foothills of the Sierras. And you know how everybody, when they own property in California, they sell it, they win big? I happened to sell the one year the market slumped in California. Sat on that house for a year. Couldn't sell it. Had to keep dropping the price. I did not win, even at selling the house. And since we couldn't get the house sold, and since I'm selling pencils at minimum wage, and I have a wife and 3 children, we ended up living in a 750 square foot cabin with a carry-out toilet and cold running water. You got to experience a cabin with a carry-out toilet and 3 children to really appreciate it. Initially, the cabin had literally a bucket with a toilet seat over it. But as we saved up some money, we moved up. We bought a porta potty that had a valve that you could seal on it. That was a real improvement. And once you sealed the valve, you could pick the porta potty up, kind of like a suitcase, a little hand, you could pick it up, and it was all sealed in. You could carry out and take it and dump it, right? That was a good thing. Unless, of course, the children didn't tell you that the potty was just about full. Because if it got too full, you couldn't seal the valve, my friends. And if you can't seal the valve, you can't use the little handle to carry it nicely out and dump it. What you have to do is you have to squat down low, wrap your arms around the porta potty, pick it up gently and keep it level, and carry it out of the house. All the time warning the children to not get in Daddy's way. And please just tell Daddy when it's getting full. When I looked at my life, if I'd had a banner to hang over my head, it would have said one word. It would have said failure. I failed my family. I failed my career. I failed my education. I failed my church. And if there was a God, I had certainly failed him. And yet, even in the middle of all of that, the burning question still that plagued me was, what about God? Is he really there? My thoughts went back even further to the previous February, to an odd encounter, a man who had prayed for Burnett and I and felt that God had given him a word for us, information about what our future held. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Kind of reminded me of this billboard the church put up. The class on prophecy has been canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. If there was a God, I believed he could do something like that. The Bible had stories like that. Common reason told me that if God, who knows all things, wanted to reveal something that was going to happen, he certainly could. But I just wasn't sure God was even there. And if he was, if he'd actually do something like that for me. I think I was the perfect agnostic. I wanted to know if any of it was real, and yet I doubted that any of it could be true. So, I know you're wondering, what did the guy say? Well, first a little background. His name was Don. I'd known about him for a few years, but he knew nothing about me. He attended the church of a good friend of mine. And my friend, fortunately, was someone that I respected a lot, a very calm, rational guy. And as we would talk, he shared with me that it oftentimes seemed that God used Don in this way. I was skeptical, to say the least, but when my world crumbled, I was also desperate to salvage it, to fulfill my call as a pastor, if God really was there. And so I asked my friend, I said, would Don ever pray with us? I'm thinking to myself, what on earth am I doing? This is nuts. We snuck out of town, didn't tell anybody where we were going. We went down to my friend's church, Southern California. We met with them, and Don began to pray for us. And as we were praying together, there was nothing extravagant or weird or lights or anything else. He just was a guy, just praying. As he began to pray for Burnett, though, he began to share some things that he felt God was showing him. He said, you're going to be moving, and you need to collect your boxes because you won't have room for your stuff where you're going. I thought that was kind of odd, but I figured, the guy could probably guess if we're from out of town and we're going through some kind of struggle. Why would I be here if I wasn't? He didn't know any of our story, but maybe he's taken a good guess at the fact we might be moving at some point. And then he said, God is preparing you for a new life he's going to bless you with, for a child. I'm thinking, great. This is his stock prophecy for young, still fertile females. 50-50 chance this one comes out. I'm also thinking to myself, his timing is really bad because we had 3 children and my wife was going through a lot of stress, actually. She was overwhelmed with small children. The last thing she wanted to hear was there might be another kid coming. But I looked at her, she seemed to be at peace, and I figured, well, you got her into it, you're just going to have to live through it now. And then he began to pray for some anxiety that she was experiencing, which I thought was interesting. And just encouraged her, prayed for her. Then he started praying for me. The first thing he said, he didn't know anything about me, but he said, God has a call on your life for ministry. Again, me, ever the skeptic, I thought, well, you know that I'm Mike's friend. I have short hair. You could probably guess I'm a pastor. And he says, but what you're going to do isn't always going to look like ministry. I didn't know what to make of that. He says, God is going to bless you in business, but I think God's going to use that to free you for ministry. But don't forget your call. Then he started to pray about my depression and the pain in my stomach. That did kind of get my attention. I had a friend who was a doctor. I'd been to see him, talked about what I was going through, and he said, Tim, out of the 10 points of clinical depression, you have 9. The only one I didn't have was I wasn't suicidal. But I was deeply depressed. And what nobody knew except my wife was that for months I had had a driving pain through my middle. It felt like someone had rammed a spear through me. It was nothing but emotional stress. But Don spent some time just praying for me about that pain, that God would touch me. There was really nothing that he shared with us that I wanted to hear. I didn't have any plans of doing anything that he talked about. None of it made any sense to me. And in fact, there was one thing going down to this. I had prayed a prayer, what Christians sometimes call setting out a fleece. It comes from an Old Testament story where God had told a guy to do something that seemed like too hard to do. And he said, okay, God, I'm not sure this really is you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little test. And I'm going to take this fleece, I'm going to set it outside, and I'm going to pray that in the morning, everything around the fleece is dry, but the fleece is wet. And when that happens, the guy says, well, okay, I'll pray the other way around, so now I want everything else to be wet and the fleece dry. And that happened too, and then the guy finally concluded that I guess this really is God. So sometimes people set up these little weird tests. They go, okay, God, if this really is you, do this. So I had set up my fleece. There was a verse. I said, God, only you and I know about this little verse of scripture that means a lot to me. And if you're even there, if Don talks about this, that would have to be you. Don doesn't say a word about it. Okay, what does that mean? I don't know. On the way home, Burnett asked me what I thought. And I said, I don't know. I don't know. I believe any of that. If that is God, God's going to have to do it. Because I have no intention of getting involved in any of this. That was February. In April, I crashed emotionally. And my wife sat down next to me on the bed as I was there in tears. And she said, honey, you can't go on like this. You have to do something. And I knew she was right. I went to the leadership of our church. Said, I'm not sure what I have to do, but I know I've got to take some time off. I asked him for a sabbatical for 3 months to try and sort it out. I said, I understand. I can't promise you at the end of this I'm coming back. I just don't know. And I totally understand if you don't feel comfortable giving me a sabbatical under those terms. If so, I'm happy to give you my resignation. They were a wonderful group of leaders. They were kind and gracious. And they said, you take the summer. No strings attached. So we did. We packed the kids up. We drove back up here to Sequim. That first day drive was a long day. I can't even describe to you the emotional pain that I was in. I'm a pretty talkative guy. My wife and I joke about the fact that our roles are a little bit reversed. Supposedly, women have more words than men. I have more words than she does. On that drive that day, though, I didn't say a word all day long. We camped that night on the Oregon coast. We got the kids put to bed. I was sitting by the fire. Burnett sat down next to me and she said, you've been pretty quiet. That was an understatement. And I said, I think I'm mourning. Everything I've ever wanted, everything I dreamed of, I think it's gone. And I don't even know if God is there. By the end of that summer, we knew what the answer was going to be. That was that I was going to resign my position. But we still had no idea what our future was going to be. We drove home, we got back to Sonora, and literally as we're stepping out of the car, I have one foot on the driveway, one foot still in the car. Our neighbor, Pat, who lived down through the trees below us, she saw us getting out of the car. She yells up and she says, "Hey guys, welcome home. Hi, Pat." And so she came walking up to the place to say hello. And as she approaches us, she says, and now no one knows what our plan is. We've not communicated with anybody what we're coming back to tell the church that I'm going to resign. Pat walks up and she says, "Well, welcome home, you guys. Do you by chance need boxes?" I'm looking at Brunette over the top of the car. Said, well, funny you should ask. Yeah, we could use boxes. Her husband was a contractor. He had just finished a large remodel on a home. The people had to move out of half of their house while it was being remodeled. They had gone out and bought all new U-Haul boxes. They had just moved back in. They folded all the boxes up, gave them to her husband, and said, "Could you get rid of these for us?" They brought us an entire stack of like new U-Haul boxes. And I got to admit, the thought did cross my mind that Don had very specifically said, "You need to be collecting your boxes." But I didn't believe it. That was just coincidence. Well, we moved to the cabin, and everything ended up in storage. In fact, in the first year, I had to move storage units 3 times. I moved my entire house 3 times and never moved into a house with any of it. And yes, I thought of what Don had said, that where you're going, there's not going to be room for your stuff. But I still didn't believe it. It had to be coincidence. He had talked about the fact that I was going to end up in business, and I did end up in business. I was trying to get a business started. If you know the statistics for new businesses starting, it's not real favorable, right? Especially if you're broke. And I started a business of buying and selling medical equipment to doctors, of which I knew absolutely nothing about. This is not your strongest business plan, I should point out. If you want to understand my life, if you ever see the movie The Pursuit of Happiness, watch that movie, and that was my life. The first time I watched it, I almost couldn't get through the movie. I said, "Honey, this is too personal. This is too painful." But I had my office set up in the cabin, so 3 children in the 750 square foot cabin with the carryout toilet and a telephone, which was my office. The kids all learned that when the phone rang, Daddy snapped his fingers, we were silent, because now we're an office. I wasn't sure I really considered that being blessed in business. One thing, though, that we definitely didn't have was a baby. No way were we having a baby. To put this delicately, we know how babies are made. We know how not to make a baby. We were not planning on making a baby. So you can see why my new friend's comment jarred my attention. I actually went to sleep praying about this. A very strange prayer. God, if there is a God, we've thought about having another child someday, but certainly not this day, but we're not getting any younger. And I don't know why I had that conversation with that lady, but God, if there is a God, I guess you know what our future holds. Please help us not to starve. So the next morning, I had another odd encounter. It was a phone call from a lady from DSHS. She asked to speak to Brunette. And I figured food stamps. We've been going to the food bank, thank you. Been going to the food bank. That was really hard for me. In fact, I couldn't go. Somehow admitting that I couldn't earn enough money to feed my family was really, really hard for me. But my wife had been going. It was a great blessing. I'm thankful this community has a food bank. But I thought, I bet it's gotten bad enough that Burnett probably has called to see if we could get food stamps. And she knows I wouldn't like it. And so she probably just didn't tell me, and now they're calling. So I went to Burnett and I said, there's a lady on the phone for you from DSHS. Any idea what that's about? And she says, oh, you need to go outside. Achieving privacy in a 700 square foot cabin takes a little effort. So there I am, standing outside of my own cabin on the porch in the morning, looking in through the window at my wife, talking to some lady on the phone, and decided, okay, fine. I'm going to go up. Her parents' house was up across the orchard, and that's where we went to get a shower because they actually had hot water. That was a good thing. Thought, I'm going to go get a shower, and I'll come back. So I went up, I took my shower, had some coffee with her dad, and came back, and Burnett met me out in the middle of the orchard. She said, well, I've got something I need to tell you. And I said, yeah, I know. You went and got food stamps, didn't you? She said, no, I didn't get food stamps. She looked at me, and she smiled. And suddenly I said, are you pregnant? And she smiled, and she nodded at me. And I just started crying. Because it was like, Tim, you can keep on calling this a coincidence if you want, or you could admit that maybe God knows something about your life that you don't know. In fact, it's interesting, she had actually been trying to take a pregnancy test for 3 days. Every time she took it, the test actually failed. It was like a bad test. Went back to the pharmacy 3 times, and it was almost like God had held her off until I'd had this conversation. I have a conversation. I go to bed praying about this whole thing about, God, if we were going to have another child. I wake up in the morning, and my wife is there to tell me we're having another child. In fact, we have an unusual distinction. I've been serving on the board of My Choices, the local pregnancy resource center, for the past 3 years. My wife volunteers 1 day a week there. But we also have the distinction that she was the very first client at My Choices when they opened their Sequim office, because we couldn't afford a pregnancy test anywhere else. So 9 months later, our son Matthew was born. The name means gift of God. For me, that was a very personal moment when suddenly my understanding of God moved from just the scientific, just the philosophical, the historical, to the personal. It said, while it blows my categories, God has somehow personally touched my life. The business survived as well. It even prospered. I'd worked on inventing a little tool for measuring 2-cycle fuel. It's called the Mixmizer. We're living in the cabin. I talked to a guy in California after months of trying to market it. He says, well, send me a copy. I sent one to him. He called me back. He said, can I take this to a trade show? I've been working on this for several years. I said, sure, take it to a trade show. I've got nothing to lose. Nobody else wants it. He called me back 2 weeks later, and he said, Kmart likes it. How soon can you make 40,000 units? Let me call you back on that. 6 weeks later, he called back, and he said, Walmart likes it too. Can you make another 40,000? That was about 18 years ago. This year, we actually crossed the 2 million unit line. My medical business, against all odds, actually worked. Bought out another company. We have a warehouse today in Marysville, and we service some of the largest networks up here in the state. I never would have guessed that or planned that. My call. What about ministry? About 3 months ago, I was asked to step back into a role as a pastor. November 15th, I'll be stepping into that role at Dungeness Community Church. Whoever would have imagined? Somebody asked me what my 5-year plan was for the church, and I said, well, 120 days ago, I didn't think I'd be doing this. So I'm a little weak in the 5-year plan department. So what did I learn? Ultimately, it's not about me and my smarts. It's about God and his love for someone who is unworthy, who in himself rightfully carried the banner of failure. Reason can lead you toward God. Only faith can lead you to follow him. How about my fleece? How come no fleece? I prayed about this thing. Wouldn't that have helped? I think it's because I had an agenda. I wanted that fleece because I knew what my future should be, and I just wanted God to confirm it. God just had different plans for me, and he didn't confirm it the way I wanted it to be. I've come to see that God has a plan and a purpose, and sometimes he takes us way out on a limb where all we can do is trust him. And I've learned that God is real. The last thing I would want anyone to do after hearing my story is try to imitate my experience. God works uniquely with each one of us. I will not give you Don's phone number. How God taps you on the shoulder is his business. Remember, his spirit is like the wind. How you respond, that's your concern. I mentioned last week about hauling stuff to the dump after we had finished my mom's estate sale. And it was the same week that I was preparing to actually give this talk the first time. And I'd been thinking about how to pull it all together, praying for the way to assemble the pieces of this puzzle, if you will. And I was driving to the dump as I was doing this, and there was a lot of stuff. I mean, my mom kept stuff pretty well pared down, but still, when you clean out a lifetime of stuff, there's a lot of stuff. And I'm hauling a 12-foot trailer piled high with papers and foam and you name it, going to the dump. I get to the dump and I start unloading, and I've thrown all this stuff out, just willy-nilly out of the trailer, and I'm down to the very end. I'm sweeping the trailer out. And as I'm sweeping the last of it out of the trailer, I look down and a little green thing catches my eye. And I bent down and I looked at it. It was a missing piece that went to the puzzle. And I said, "Wow, God, thank you. That's it. It's the missing piece." My question would be, is there a piece that is missing from your puzzle? We've had this puzzle up here for a few weeks. Behind all of the reason, there is the heart. What is the piece that every one of us needs to fill the hole in the heart? Blaise Pascal asked the question this way: what else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace? This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. The Church Father Augustine put it this way: our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Might I suggest to you that the piece that fills the hole in each of our hearts is Jesus. If in fact he really did rise from the dead, if God did that, if God is our creator and he knows how our heart is made, I believe that this is the piece that fulfills us. We can try filling it with all kinds of other things. We can fill it with relationships, with substances, with possessions, but nothing is going to fill the space that only God can fill. You know, as I drove home that day, I was laughing about this little puzzle piece because you just can't make this kind of stuff up. But I also thought of a verse in the Bible that has a lot of O's. This little piece is the letter O out of the alphabet. And I thought of another verse that has a lot of O's. It is John 3:16. You probably know it well. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For me, the pieces of the puzzle have led me back to faith. I see the evidence for God as creator in the world all around. While pain and hurt and suffering bother me as much as the next person, the Christian answer helps me make sense of it and helps me to find hope in the midst of hardship. The evidence for the resurrection is what prodded me to take the claims of Jesus seriously and to see him as the answer to my heart's cry. And the relentless tap of God on my shoulder drew me to a point of decision. The question is, what will you do with this piece of the puzzle? A.M. Farrar, quoted by John Polkinghorne in his book, said this: "Peasants and housekeepers find what philosophers seek in vain. The substance of truth is grasped, not by argument, but by faith." I'm going to ask the musicians to come on up. And I would like to just pray with and for you for a moment. Would you bow your heads? Father God, I can only stand here tonight and say thank you for taking someone like me who doubted so completely, someone like you, and yet not casting me aside. Thank you for graciously exhibiting yourself in the world around, that we look and we see the evidence that you are great and powerful and creative. Thank you that in the midst of our pain, our suffering, there's the assurance that you are not a God who has stayed remote and distant from us, but that your own Son entered into the greatest and the deepest of our suffering and took it on himself. Thank you for the evidence that points to the miracle of the resurrection, that promises us that if you could do that, you have the power over everything. That to give our lives to you, we put our hands into the hand of a God who is gracious and powerful and good. And thank you for the ways that you touch each one of us. I pray for people here tonight, Lord, just people like me that have struggles, that have doubts, that aren't sure where all the pieces of the puzzle go. Lord, I ask that you'd bring the right pieces together, that for those that believe in you but maybe struggle, that they could rest, that they could have confidence. For those that are still perhaps on the outside looking in, God, I pray that they would see that in your Son, you have extended an open hand, an open invitation to them to have that place in their heart filled in a way that only you can fill it. I pray, God, that you have been pleased with what's been shared, what's been done here these last few weeks, and that you would continue to do good, kind, loving things in the lives of all those who have taken the time to listen. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. I would like to that I have found to be my experience. And it's my prayer that it be your experience as well. That you would find that God is a good, good Father.
And I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard tender whispers of love. In the dead of night, you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. And I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still into love, love, love. You are perfect in all of your ways. Perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. And I've read all the stories of love and your discipline, and I welcome all you want in me, refining me to who I am as you change me with your fire, your love, peace, and joy. You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. You are perfect. You are perfect. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am.
Well, a little epilogue. So, whatever happened to the little family in the little cabin? Well, they grew up. On the left there is our oldest son, Michael, and his wife, Mickey, and their little boy, Evan. They just had another little one here a few weeks ago, Theo. And then right next to them is our son, David. Last week I showed you David, the Sasquatch. And yesterday, David got engaged. So he and Christina are getting married. It's like a February wedding is coming up. Then we've got our son, Matthew. More about him in a minute. Next to them, our daughter, Angela, and her husband, Matt. And Matthew was our little promise, our surprise. He also is the band's drummer. So... And there is one more person that I need to recognize because she has stuck with me for 32 years through everything, including a carry-out toilet and 4 children. And I would like to have her come up here, my wife, Burnett. Yeah. I couldn't ask for a better partner. I want to thank all of you for coming, listening to my story. I would thank all the musicians, all the volunteers that have helped make this happen. My goodness, some of the people, Jennifer with her clay art, and Jody and Jesse with their story and their music, and the Stardust Band, and Kevin Magner and his band, and there's been so many people that have shared, and I am truly thankful. And I hope it's been an encouragement and a blessing to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to come. And Phil, I'm going to turn it over to you.